안녕하세요.
The city lights of Seoul shimmered like a sea of fallen stars, illuminating the penthouse where Kang Ji-ho, the enigmatic billionaire, stood gazing at the horizon. He had everything: wealth, power, and influence, yet none of it had ever made his heart race the way it did when she walked into the room. Yoon So-ah was different. She wasn't like the women who threw themselves at his feet, eager to become part of his empire. She was quiet, hardworking, and undeniably beautiful in an effortless way. The first time he saw her, she was meticulously arranging the silverware in his dining room, her delicate fingers placing each piece with precision. She never looked at him directly. Perhaps that was what intrigued him the most. So-ah had been working as a housemaid in Ji-ho's home for 6 months. It was an unspoken rule that the staff remained invisible, their presence acknowledged only when necessary. And yet, Ji-ho found himself noticing her more and more. The way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear when she thought no one was watching. The way she bit her lip when she was deep in thought. The soft, restrained sound of her laughter when she spoke with the other staff. But she was promised to another man. A marriage arranged by her family, bound by centuries of tradition and obligation. Her engagement had been announced weeks ago, and Ji-ho had overheard the whispers in his own house. Her future husband was the son of a wealthy chaebol family, a man with the right bloodline, status, and connections. A perfect match, one that would secure her family's future. Except she didn't love him. Ji-ho saw it in her eyes the night they finally spoke. It was after a charity event, well past midnight, when he found her in the kitchen washing dishes. He entered without a word, leaning against the counter as he watched her. Eventually, she noticed his presence. "Sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "do you need something?" He could have come up with 1,000 reasons for being there, but none of them would have been true. Instead, he asked, "Do you want to marry him?" She froze. Her fingers tightened around the sponge. When she finally looked at him, her eyes held something raw: fear, uncertainty, longing. "It's not about what I want," she said after a long silence. "What if it was?" Ji-ho stepped closer, his heart thundering. "What if you had a choice?" She let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "People like me don't have choices, Mr. Kang." Then he reached out, his fingers barely brushing hers as he took the plate from her hands and set it aside. "Then let me give you one." She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw the storm hidden behind her serene exterior, a storm that mirrored his own. The world would never approve. Her family would disown her. His rivals would call it a scandal. But none of it mattered. Not when she was standing before him, holding her breath, waiting for the moment that would change everything. "Run away with me," Ji-ho whispered. And for the first time in her life, Yoon So-ah considered saying yes. Night slowly descended over Seoul, and the city, once alive with lights and noise, now felt silent to Yoon So-ah. Ji-ho's whispered invitation still echoed in her mind. Run away? With him? The idea was as tempting as it was terrifying. She knew what was at stake, yet she couldn't deny that for a fleeting moment, she had wanted to say yes. The next day, So-ah tried to avoid Ji-ho. She kept herself busy cleaning hallways, organizing books in the mansion's private library, anything to keep her away from his piercing gaze. But Ji-ho was not the kind of man who accepted being ignored. He found her in the garden at sunset. The scene looked like an old painting, the sky stained with hues of orange and purple. So-ah absent-mindedly ran her fingers over the petals of a flower. When she felt his presence, she didn't need to turn around to know it was him. "You avoided me all day." His voice was low but filled with intent. So-ah closed her eyes for a moment before turning to face him. "You shouldn't have said that to me last night. It was a mistake." Ji-ho frowned. "Do you really believe that?" She didn't answer right away. A soft breeze lifted a loose strand of her hair, and Ji-ho suppressed the urge to tuck it behind her ear. Instead, he took a step closer, narrowing the space between them. "What happened to you, So-ah?" he finally asked, his voice laced with something close to pain. "Why do you accept this fate as if it were unchangeable?" She laughed, but there was no joy in it. "Do you think my life has ever been easy? That I've always had a choice? My family fell into debt years ago, Ji-ho. This marriage is the only way to ensure my mother doesn't lose the house she lives in. I'm not some fairy tale princess who can just run away for love." Ji-ho clenched his fists. "And you think money is enough to replace your happiness? To replace what you feel?" She looked away, unable to face the intensity in his eyes. "Feelings don't always matter, Ji-ho." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken words and restrained emotions. Ji-ho took a deep breath, trying to control his frustration. "If you were really certain about that, you wouldn't be trembling right now," he whispered. So-ah held her breath. Before she could respond, a distant voice called her name. Her heart sped up as she recognized her mother's voice coming from inside the house. "I have to go," she said quickly, turning to leave. Ji-ho watched as she disappeared into the mansion, knowing that somehow this conversation was far from over. Something inside him told him that So-ah was fighting against something far bigger than herself, and he had no intention of giving up on her so easily. However, the night still had another surprise in store for him. Ji-ho returned to the mansion's library, one of the few places where he could find peace. But this time, the tranquility was interrupted by a sealed envelope left on the dark mahogany desk. His name was written in his mother's elegant handwriting. With an uneasy feeling, he opened the letter. The words inside hit him like a punch to the gut. "Ji-ho, you need to forget Yoon So-ah. If you persist, the weight of our family will fall upon you. Choose wisely. Your mother." He closed his eyes, letting the letter slip through his fingers. The feeling of powerlessness was something he rarely experienced, but now it was the real and relentless. Ji-ho had never bowed to threats, and this time would be no different. Time passed, but the tension between Ji-ho and So-ah became unbearable. Neither of them spoke about their conversation in the garden or the letter Ji-ho had found, and yet avoiding each other now seemed impossible. So-ah tried to stand firm in her decision, continuing her routine as if nothing had changed. Her days were filled with household chores and formal interactions with the other staff in the mansion. But Ji-ho was not a man easily ignored. That night, a business dinner brought influential members of society to Ji-ho's home. The mansion was immaculate, the guests dressed in their finest suits and gowns, and the orchestra played softly in the background. So-ah moved discreetly, trying to remain unnoticed. But Ji-ho's eyes followed her every movement. He watched as one of the guests, Choi Min-sok, a young heir from a powerful chaebol family, struck up a conversation with So-ah in the kitchen. Min-sok was charming, and to a casual observer, he might have seemed merely polite. But Ji-ho noticed the way he leaned in slightly, how his eyes analyzed every detail of her expression. Ji-ho clenched his fists, as So-ah lowered her head in a respectful nod, yet maintained her firm posture. He saw her subtly refuse Min-sok's attempt to touch her arm, stepping away with polite distance. Still, something inside Ji-ho ignited. Without thinking, he crossed the hall, his imposing presence drawing attention. Min-sok raised an eyebrow, surprised when Ji-ho stopped beside So-ah, his gaze cold and calculated. "You have work to do, So-ah." His voice was low, but firm. So-ah's eyes met Ji-ho's in surprise, and for a brief moment, a spark of defiance flickered in them. But she merely nodded, stepping away without argument. Min-sok chuckled quietly, watching Ji-ho with amusement. "Interesting," Min-sok mused, crossing his arms. "Do you always take such a personal interest in your employees, Kang Ji-ho?" Ji-ho held his gaze, unwavering. Only when boundaries are crossed. The exchange was brief, but the message was clear. Min-sok smiled, though something sharp lurked behind his eyes. "I see. I hope you haven't forgotten that some things are beyond your control." Ji-ho didn't respond. He simply watched as Min-sok walked away, his heart pounding, not just with anger, but with something deeper, something far more dangerous. He knew this night would change everything. When So-ah left the kitchen, her heart was still racing. Was Ji-ho protecting her or merely asserting his dominance? She couldn't tell, but her body still trembled from the intensity of the moment. Before she could return to her work, a firm hand caught her wrist. She turned sharply only to find Min-sok again. His usual smile was gone. Instead, his eyes held something more calculated. Don't be naive, So-ah. His voice was low, controlled. Do you really think Kang Ji-ho can save you? He doesn't have that power. Not against what's coming. So-ah pulled her arm away, her gaze unwavering. I don't need saving, and I certainly don't need threats. Min-sok tilted his head slightly, as if reassessing her. You're braver than I expected, but that won't stop the inevitable. He walked away, leaving So-ah standing alone in the midst of the bustling dinner. The air around her felt heavy, and for the first time, she realized just how deeply entangled she was in something far beyond her control. From a distance, Ji-ho watched, his fists clenched. He knew Min-suk wasn't speaking idly. Something was moving behind the scenes, and So-ah was at the center of a game he couldn't afford to lose. The rain drummed softly against the towering windows of the Kang mansion, echoing through the silence of the grand hall. So-ah lingered near the grand staircase, her heart pounding too fast. She wasn't sure if she should be there, but Ji-ho had been clear in his message. Meet me in the library. We need to talk. Hesitant, she crossed the dimly lit corridor, feeling the weight of unspoken words between them. Since the dinner, everything had changed. Min-suk had issued his veiled threat, and Ji-ho seemed determined to challenge him. So-ah knew she was at the center of something much larger than she could control. She pushed open the library doors and found Ji-ho standing by the fireplace. The flickering fire cast dramatic shadows across his tense face. He held an envelope between his fingers, his expression dark. Do you trust me, So-ah? He asked, without pretense. She blinked, caught off guard by the intensity of his voice. What do you mean? Ji-ho tossed the envelope onto the table. Read it. With trembling hands, So-ah opened the envelope. Inside were documents and photographs. Her gaze skimmed over them until her blood ran cold. It was a copy of her arranged marriage contract. But what truly made her breath hitch was another Shitan official financial agreement between her father and Min, Sok's family. This can't be true, she murmured, dizziness overtaking her. My father wouldn't do this to me. Ji-ho stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. He did. So, you're not just a bride in this agreement. You're collateral. Your marriage isn't about tradition, it's about money. Your family was sold. She shook her head, unwilling to accept it. Why are you showing me this? What do you want from me, Ji-ho? He took a deep breath before answering, his eyes burning with restrained emotion. I want you to choose, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but for yourself. Running away with me is still an option. So-ah clutched the documents to her chest, torn between loyalty to her family and the brutal truth she had just uncovered. The air in the library felt heavy, thick with impossible choices. But before she could respond, a sharp noise from the hallway made them both freeze. Someone was listening. Ji-ho blew out the candles with a swift motion and pulled So-ah into the shadows between the bookshelves. Their eyes met in the darkness, and for a brief moment, the world narrowed to the space between them. But there was no time for that. The door creaked open slowly. It sounded like a whispered threat. Min-sok stepped inside, his expression laced with suspicion and something else. A cold satisfaction. What a surprise, finding you two here so late. He crossed his arms. What exactly are you discussing? So-ah felt Ji-ho tense beside her, her heart pounded in her chest. Business. Ji-ho replied coolly. Something that doesn't concern you. Min-suk let out a quiet chuckle. Anything involving my fiancé concerns me, don't you think? The silence that followed was thick with unspoken meaning. Ji-ho clenched his fist but held himself back. So-ah, feeling the weight of the decision she had to make, finally stepped forward. I am not your property, Min-sok. Her voice was steady. And I will not let my life be decided by a piece of paper. Min-suk studied her, a dark glint passing through his eyes. Be careful with your words, So-ah. Not everyone has the luxury of making choices. Ji-ho took a step forward. But she does, and you won't be the one to take that away from her. Min-sok held his gaze for a long moment before letting out a theatrical sigh. Very well, but I hope you both understand what you're getting yourselves into. Because once you take this path, there's no turning back. He left the library, but the tension lingered. So-ah turned to Ji-ho. who was still staring at the door. "Now do you understand?" he asked softly. "This is bigger than the both of us, but if you want to fight, I will fight with you." So-ah took a deep breath. The fear was still there, but so was the courage. And for the first time, she knew exactly what she had to do. The night in Seoul had never felt so silent. The meeting in the library had sealed a decision that would change everything. So-ah now knew the truth, and Ji-ho was ready to face the consequences alongside her. But what came next was a leap into the unknown. The weight of her choice pressed heavily on So-ah's shoulders as she walked down the long corridor of the mansion. Her steps were light, but her mind was racing. She couldn't ignore the fear swirling in her chest. Min-seok had made it clear he wouldn't give up so easily. When she reached the grand entrance, she stopped. Rain drummed against the glass windows, and a cold wind swept through the city outside. Ji-ho was waiting for her in a dark car, the engine humming softly, ready to take her away. But something stopped her from stepping through that door. A familiar voice made her freeze. "Are you really going to do this?" Min-seok emerged from the shadows, his face partially illuminated by the dim corridor light. So-ah closed her eyes for a moment, before turning to face her imposed fiancé. "I have no other choice, Min-seok." He chuckled softly, crossing his arms. "There's always a choice, So-ah, but you're about to make the wrong one. Ji-ho may seem like a strong man, but he can't protect you from what's coming." A shiver ran down her spine. "What do you mean by that?" Min-seok took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You don't understand the forces at play. This marriage isn't just a deal between our families. It's a pact between empires. If you run, Ji-ho will be destroyed. And you, So-ah, you will never be safe." A clap of thunder roared outside, as if the universe itself echoed his words. Doubt crept into her heart. She knew Min-seok never made idle threats. But Ji-ho was waiting outside, ready to challenge the world for her. She took a deep breath, gathering every fragment of courage she had left. "I choose my own destiny, Min-seok, no one else." Before he could respond, So-ah turned on her heels and stepped through the door. The cold wind and rain lashed against her face, but she didn't hesitate. She ran toward the car, where Ji-ho stood with the door open for her. "Are you sure?" he asked, his eyes searching hers for a final confirmation. So-ah nodded. "Yes, let's go." Ji-ho didn't waste a second. The car sped down the rain-soaked road, leaving behind the life So-ah had always known. But in the rearview mirror, she saw Min-seok standing motionless in the rain, his fists clenched and his gaze dark with promised retaliation. She knew this story was far from over. The road stretched ahead, slick from the relentless rain. Inside the car, silence hung thick like a dense fog. Ji-ho kept his hands steady on the wheel, while So-ah gazed at the blurred landscape rushing past. With every mile they left behind, the reality of her decision settled deeper into her bones. "You don't have to do this, So-ah." Ji-ho finally broke the silence, his voice low but laced with unspoken emotions. She turned to him, her gaze unwavering despite the turmoil inside. "And do you think I could go back? Do you think I could look my father in the eye, face Min-seok, and pretend I'm still the same person?" Ji-ho pressed his lips together, offering no response. He knew there was no turning back. And yet, fear lingered not for himself, but for her. "Min-seok won't give up," he murmured. "Neither will your family. They'll come after you. They'll pressure you. They'll try to convince you that you made a mistake." So-ah let out a deep sigh, shifting her gaze toward the darkness beyond the horizon. "Then I'll have to prove them wrong." The car finally slowed as Ji-ho pulled up in front of a small roadside motel. It was simple, discreet, a temporary hiding place. He killed the engine but made no move to step out. "I don't want you to lose everything because of me," she whispered. Ji-ho let out a faint, lopsided smile, but there was sadness in his eyes. "Do you think I haven't already?" For a long moment, the world seemed to shrink down to just the two of them. The sound of the rain, the warmth in their lingering gazes, the uncertain fate waiting beyond that door. "I don't know what will happen next, Ji-ho," So-ah admitted. "But for the first time I'm choosing something for myself." Ji-ho nodded slowly. "Then no matter what happens, you've already won." She smiled soft, hesitant but real. Then, without another word, she opened the car door and stepped into the rain. Ji-ho followed right behind, shielding her from the cold wind as they entered the motel. That night, they had no guarantees, no certainties, only each other. And for now, maybe that was enough. Hours later, Ji-ho sat against the headboard of the small motel room bed, watching So-ah sleep. The exhaustion of their escape had finally overtaken her, and he allowed himself a rare moment of peace. But that peace shattered the instant his phone vibrated on the bedside table. He picked it up, his body stiffening at the name flashing across the screen. Min-suk. A sinking feeling settled in his gut as he answered, pressing the phone to his ear without a word. Silence lingered on the other end before Min-suk finally spoke, his voice calm but dripping with menace. "You can run, Ji-ho, but not for long. You know it. I know it. And so, she'll find out the hard way." Ji-ho gripped the phone tighter, his jaw clenching. "If you lay a finger on her, Min-suk, I swear." A cold chuckle came through the line. "No need for threats. I'm a reasonable man. You know what you need to do. If you truly want to protect her, give her back. End this now, before she really gets hurt." The line went dead. Ji-ho sat there, his fingers tightening around the phone as if he could crush it in his grip. The rain continued to fall outside, but now it felt like a warning of what was to come. He looked at So-ah, still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the storm gathering around them. They had won a battle, but the war had only just begun.
You're my eternal